to start live stream. Well, welcome everybody to Convocation. Today is our last presentation of the semester and of the school year. And to start, I first really wanted to thank people who made Convocation possible. First to Annette and Taryn, who have prepared the meals for the speakers afterwards. To Kirsten and Esther, who have made sure that all of the tech has worked well. And then of course Gary Chistiter and his staff who have done the live stream for us. Also those who have worked on the website, Jim Bob's Pipes, and Catherine Burrow, who has helped us with advertising. And then of course Noah's administration, especially David Allred, Michael Austin, President McKiff, who have made Convocation possible for all of us. And then and the TAs who have been really crucial in the whole effort of making this possible weekly. And then of course for all of you for attending regularly and being involved. So thanks so much. Today is again our last speaker, and I'm really excited for this. Our speaker is Dr. Benjamin Park. He received a bachelor degree in history and in English from Brigham Young University, and then went across the Atlantic Ocean for graduate school in the University of Edinburgh for a master's degree, and then another master's degree and a PhD in history at the University of Cambridge. Afterwards, he worked at the University of Missouri as a postdoctoral fellow, and is now an assistant professor at Sam Houston State University, professor of history. He is also the author of American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, which was published by Liveright, which is a subsidiary of W.W. Norton, early this January. And if you haven't got the book, right, you'll have the chance to buy it right after. And another one of his books includes The Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, which won the Mormon History Association's Best Book prize. And I actually had the chance of reviewing this for an academic journal, and it was the highest praise I have ever given a book in a review that I've written before. And he has also published American Nationalisms, Imagining Union in the Age of Revolutions with the University of Cambridge Press, and also a textbook on American religious history, as well as a compilation of essays about Mormon historian D. Michael Quinn. His presentation today is called Captain Moroni at the Capitol Insurrection, The Road to Modern Conservatism. So let's give a round of applause for Dr. Park.
You got it. Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you for those of you who came out. Sounds like a wonderful class, and I'm honored to be able to participate in the lecture series. Those who took part in the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of 2021 wore an array of outfits. Many donned hoodies and jeans as if they were out for a leisurely stroll, while others exhibited fatigues and camouflage as if preparing for battle. One participant, however, stood out more than any other. Nathan Wayne and Trinken dressed up as Captain Moroni, a central figure in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Book of Mormon. In a frenzied interview with reporters at the scene, Trinken described Moroni as a freedom fighter from ancient times. He then regaled the reporter and astonished bystanders alike with a hurried explanation of the sacred text, that Native Americans were descendants of Israel, and that pre-Christ Christians lived in the Americas and made the land a sacred place for Republican principles. He clarified that the flag he was waving mimicked the flag that Moroni himself had waved when confronting the evil kingmen in the 1st century BCE. In a day filled with outrage and shock, Intrenkin's outfit added some levity. It also added some confusion. One report described him as wearing a Roman gladiator's outfit. Though the serious nature of the events eventually caught up to him when he was arrested and pled guilty for trespassing. To a degree, Intrenkin's participation at the Capitol insurrection, what some have deemed the largest expression of white Christian nationalism in modern America, matches a popular stereotype. Mormons supported Trump at a higher percentage than any other religious group other than white evangelicals, and Latter-day Saints are arguably the most reliable Republican voting bloc in the nation. To be a Mormon, in the popular imagination, means to favor conservative politics. But that has not always been the case. Today, I'd like to walk through the long, awkward, and uneven trajectory that led the Saints, as they called themselves, from being vehemently anti-American to tepid Democrats, and from strong FDR backers to a firm component of the religious right coalition. To do so, I'll be highlighting four men at the center of Mormonism's evolving political saga: Joseph Smith, George Buchanan, J. Reuben Clark, and Ezra Taft Benson, each of whom represented crucial eras for cultural transformation. This is not just a story of religious trivia, however, though the Mormon narrative is fascinating in its own right. Rather, to tell the story of Mormonism's political evolution is to narrate the broader contours of religious development in America, the give and take between church and state, the transience of pragmatic allegiances, and a reminder that not everything we take for granted was always predetermined. To see how Mormons got to this point is to reinforce that the future is also up for grabs, both for the United States as well as for its most famous homegrown religion. In other words, I believe the story is important to all of you not just to learn the historical craft, but to examine the human experience, how communities are shaped by the world around them, and how change happens slowly but surely, and how what the world looks like today is not synonymous with how it looked before, which should remind us that we also don't know what it will look like in the future. The humanistic inquiry into historical change, therefore, reaffirms the importance of knowledge and investigation. Start with Act 1, Origins. The Church of Christ, as it was originally known, was initially interpreted as a political protest. The earliest readers of the Book of Mormon, which founder Joseph Smith claimed to have translated from ancient gold records that detailed the existence of ancient Christian civilizations in the Americas, highlighted its anti-democracy ethos. God's people in the text chose to follow a series of divine monarchs who also happened to be appointed patriarchs, a fusion of church and state that distrusted the majoritarian voice of humankind. Critics therefore denounced the Book of Mormon's believers, soon called Mormons, as dissenters from America's democratic tradition. Yet the scriptural text was inconsistent in its anti-majoritarian message, instead offering a political theology that was far from fully systematic, but instead embodied an uneasiness with any form of governance that did not prioritize God's will. A common critique found among many American evangelicals of the day who comprised what one scholar called a quasi-religious establishment. But if the Saints did not match the anti-democratic stereotype placed on them, they very quickly learned to distrust majoritarian politics. Members of the church were forced to vacate settlements in Pennsylvania, New York, Missouri, and Ohio, as local communities denounced what they deemed as fanatical neighbors and objected to them acting as insular groups when it came to commerce and politics. It was amid their conflict in Missouri that Joseph Smith, the founding prophet, dictated a revelation that urged the Saints to petition government for redress. Quote, "For this purpose I have established the constitution of this land," the revelation trumpeted, "by the hands of wise men whom I have raised up unto this very purpose." Many Americans believed the Constitution was divinely inspired, of course, but the Mormons nearly canonized it. Yet state and federal officials refused to intercede in local matters, appealing instead to the Jacksonian principle of individual sovereign and local sovereignty. Undeterred, Smith marshaled his own Mormon army to retake the lands, only withdrawing when victory seemed bleak. These episodes taught the church that they could not rely on existing political structures to promote their interests. After thousands of saints were forced at gunpoint to vacate their settlement in Missouri over a cold and grisly winter in 1838, they settled in what they hoped would be a political refuge in Illinois. It was there that Smith exerted his political muscle. Illinois at the time was divided between the era's two political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, both of whom salivated at the prospect of courting thousands of Mormon votes. Party leaders tripped over each other to try to win Mormon support, a dynamic that the saints successfully leveraged to their own advantage. The most efficient way to assure influence turned out to be through block voting, or the orchestration of all Latter-day Saint votes toward a specific candidate they believed best supported their interests. And politicians listened. Perhaps my favorite example includes an aspiring politician named John Harper, who was eyeing one of the state's new congressional seats in 1842. The summer before the election, he wrote Smith this letter requesting Smith's private support and assured the prophet that he had never affiliated with the county's anti-Mormon party. However, the very next day after writing this letter, Harper caught wind that word was spreading that he had indeed attended an anti-Mormon convention just the previous year. Caught red-handed, Harper dashed off another letter to Smith and admitted that he had, in fact, attended the anti-Mormon convention, but only to urge its attendees to take sympathy on the church and to see that Nauvoo was a blessing for the state. Harper's reasoning was obviously desperate, but it reflected the broader desire for Nauvoo's potentially decisive votes. And not to give a spoiler, but Harper did not win Nauvoo's support. Because in general, the Saints proved very systematic and successful in pulling their votes for desired candidates. Here you see one voting record from that 1842 election and how synchronized their votes were. As you might imagine, Illinois residents outside of Nauvoo cried foul. To them, this was the type of backroom dealing between church and state that had been abolished. Listening to ecclesiastical leaders for voting cues disrupted the democratic balance and trampled upon the individual conscience. One observer claimed that, quote, when a body of men acting under the garb of religion shall decide our elections and act together as a body politically, it was time to bid a final farewell to our liberties and the common rights of man. Another denounced this clannish principle of voting in mass at the dictation of one man as repugnant to the principles of our Republican form of government. Things only escalated from there. As the Mormons' political actions drew further criticism, Smith's responses only became more desperate. Privately, he launched a presidential campaign in 1844 that was designed to spark public sympathy. Privately, he and his closest followers created a clandestine theocratic council envisioned to replace all world governments, which included a replacement for the U.S. Constitution. Tensions eventually erupted in June of 1844 when a combination of internal dissent, including from saints who disapproved of Smith's theological innovations like polygamy, and external agitation resulted in Smith being killed by an extralegal mob while being held in state custody in a county jail. The 5 leading lynchers were eventually acquitted based on the principle that the few could not be punished for enacting the will of the many. Finally shorn of all political supporters, Mormons were forced to migrate once again, this time outside America's boundaries as they set their sights on Mexico's northern territory. Yet the saints could not escape America, no matter how much they believed it to be a failed nation. Within a year of settling on the coast of the Great Salt Lake, negotiations at the end of the US-Mexico War resulted in America's expanding empire claiming the entire region. The Mormons now played a crucial role in the nation's attempt to colonize the West. Brigham Young, Joseph Smith's successor, quickly pivoted in response. While they had initially envisioned a theocratic empire, they now petitioned for statehood, hoping that local autonomy would mean political isolation. The scope of their appeal was astounding. The proposed state of Deseret encompassed present-day Utah and Nevada, as well as substantial portions of Colorado, Arizona, and Southern California. You always got to get your Southern California beachfront property. It would have been the largest state in the nation. The proposal did not receive much traction, big surprise, especially after the Saints publicly announced their practice of polygamy in 1852. Instead, Congress established Utah Territory with much more limited powers and perimeters. The Saints could not be trusted, the government believed, as autonomous citizens. Things grew worse for the Mormons when the Republican Party was formed in 1854 and almost immediately identified Utah as a key target. Their inaugural party platform called for the complete eradication of the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. The GOP became the leaders in challenging Mormon sovereignty, many calling for the complete annihilation of the faith. It is here that I want to introduce the second key figure to my story, George Q. Cannon. Cannon had a distinctive look, a round frame, high forehead, and well-manicured beard, but was better known for his mastery of words. Born in Liverpool, England in 1827, Cannon migrated with his family to Nauvoo in 1842 and was soon integrated into church leadership by the time of his young adulthood. His rise in reputation was such that when Utah legislators petitioned for statehood once again in 1862, they chose the young apostle as a presumptive senator. Cannon immediately traveled to D.C. with hopes to strengthen the Mormons' petition. Cannon's goal to achieve Utah statehood would have failed during any year during this era, but it was especially doomed during this particularly historic congressional session, the summer of 1852 or 62. The same summer that he was in the nation's capital, from May to June of 1862, was a period in which American federal government powers were fundamentally transformed. It was then that Lincoln and the Republicans fulfilled their promises to secure enough federal sovereignty to add order to colonial expansion, exert territorial control, and regulate societal morality. On May 20th, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, which lowered the barriers for white settlers in the West. A month later, another bill forever outlawed slavery in any federal territory. On July 1st, Lincoln approved an act to fund the public railroad. And finally, a week later, on July 8th, the president signed the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, which criminalized polygamy. These acts set the stage for September when, in the culmination of the Republican Party's quest for an activist government, Lincoln announced his intent to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. These bills strengthened congressional power once and for all. While the Moral Anti-Bigamy Bill itself proved to be feckless, it launched a new era of federal prosecution of Mormon polygamy. Cannon spent the next 3 years shuttling between Utah and D.C., trying to blunt Republican efforts. Here you see a political cartoon from the time, very subtle, showing the Mormons bringing their cannon up to the Washington Congress. Because of the united GOP front, Cannon quickly identified his best allies, the Democratic Party, who were at the time fighting to oppose federal intervention into the southern states during the Reconstruction era. Cannon went through great lengths to ingratiate himself to Southern politicians. He presented himself as an ostentatious but cultivated Virginia farmer, including employing a black valet, and supported Democratic opposition to Reconstruction policies. At first, the coalition worked. Democratic support allowed him to retain his seat when when Republicans sought to expel him. And the surprising coalition avoided any major anti-polygamy legislation for several years. It also helped that the church wired Cannon money to bribe persuadable congressmen. Yet the federal government only became more devoted to the anti-polygamy cause. Politicians in the 1880s were anxious to prove that they could rule the minority communities that comprised Western territories. Here is a cartoon that depicts the troublesome bedfellows that Uncle Sam was tasked to oversee, including polygamous Mormons, Native Americans, and the Chinese. Even as Democrats and Republicans continued to battle for partisan supremacy, the government increasingly acted as an imperial power both willing and able to restrict citizen boundaries. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, as well as the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which subverted tribal land holdings. Passed between those bills were other acts that made it easier to prosecute polygamists and even disincorporate the LDS Church. All these acts expanded federal authority to regulate who was embraced within the national body. These debates over the rights of citizenship, the right to immigrate, the right to own land, the right to marry plurally, encapsulated America's modern and increasingly constricting definitions of liberty. Cannon quickly realized it was a losing battle. Democratic support for his cause eroded, and he was expelled from his delegate seat in 1882. Then, within 3 years, the entire church leadership was forced into hiding to avoid prosecution. The church was governed from the underground as fugitives from the law for half a decade. Eventually, over 1,000 Mormons served time in jail after being convicted of unlawful cohabitation, including Cannon, who served his sentence in 1887 after being caught. One scholar has noted that the Mormon attempt to evade polygamous prosecution was the longest act of civil disobedience in American history. Cannon was willing to continue this stalemate so long as he believed that God willed it. However, by 1890, it became clear that the church could not survive much longer. If they continued their resistance, the church would be required to give up nearly all their financial and physical resources, including those temples that had already been completed. But in those darkest hours, Cannon found a sliver of hope in the form of political realignment. Cannon began meeting with Republican officials in the spring of 1890 to plot a future collaboration that would be fruitful to both the Saints and the GOP. If it is to be a matter of politics, one Republican operative said, that changes the affair entirely. Cannon soon abandoned the Democrats, whom he denounced as helpless, and built bridges with his former enemies. My mind leans very much to the Republican Party, he noted in July, as being the party just now that can bring us relief. He proved the Saints' worth by lobbying Mormon support for Republicans in Wyoming's elections in the summer of 1890. Cannon hoped their politicking proved they could be an important voting bloc in the Mountain West. As the final sacrifice needed to halt federal opposition, of course, the church finally renounced polygamy in September of 1890. The Mormons then commenced an awkward, uneven, and inconsistent dance with America's two-party system. Cannon was now faced with a dilemma. Utah's potential statehood rested on their ability to nurture a fragile relationship with the Republican Party. But most of the Saints were still aligned with the Democrats. Members had previously affiliated with the People's Party, a Mormon-backed organization that largely mirrored Democratic principles, but was disbanded in 1891. Cannon and other leaders launched a mission to convert more Mormons to the GOP. They even sent some apostles on a speaking tour to pronounce the party's benefits. Now, what did the Republicans get out of the surprising alliance? Well, a resurging Democratic Party in the South and growing disenchantment over corruption charges in the North had whittled away at what had been the GOP's national dominance. The Republicans' best hope to regain control was therefore to form an impenetrable voting bloc in the West. Because these Western societies featured hierarchical structures and racial politics more reflective of the antebellum South, however, Republicans now reconsidered core principles and reevaluated previous allegiances. Accessing Mormonism's extended reach through the mountain states was a central part of this project, and they were thrilled when the party earned surprising victories in Utah in the early 1890s. Utah's Democratic Party, led by several prominent Mormons, however, were apoplectic. Even the Republican-leading Salt Lake Tribune called the maneuvering a common vulgar bargain. Most perturbed were two prominent church leaders, B.H. Roberts and Moses Thatcher. Both had deep Democratic ties and felt the church's covert Republican support was a betrayal. They were especially angry that several apostles were allowed to publicly support the Republicans, while they, one an apostle, one a 70, were told to hold their tongue. These were novel problems for a leadership that had, for the most part, shared a singular political platform for decades. Bloc voting drew the consternation of American contemporaries, but it also solidified cultural unity. Yet it quickly became apparent that such division helped the church. As another apostle astutely put it, the little tilt with the Democratic Mormons will do more to satisfy the people of the world that we are sincere than a great amount of talk will do. America, in other words, was more willing to embrace a divided Mormon hierarchy than a united one. Despite Democratic misgivings, the political calculus worked, as Utah achieved statehood in 1896 through Republican support. To celebrate, they sewed the largest American flag yet crafted and hung it first from inside the tabernacle and later from the side of the Salt Lake Temple. Given the history I've been outlining, you can see the irony of this image. By 1890, the Latter-day Saint community was politically divided, as most church leaders now leaned Republican, while a majority of lay members favored the Democrats. It was a bargain that brought costs and benefits. Mormons had achieved statehood, but lost their unity. They lost their sovereignty, but achieved more credibility. It was the first of many uneven and inchoate steps toward cultural and political assimilation. In a period of pragmatic bargains across the nation, the saints were making their own. A key moment in the new Mormon-Republican alliance in the early 20th century was the election of Reed Smoot, a member of the church's Quorum of the 12 Apostles, to the U.S. Senate in 1903. Smoot possessed a tall frame, narrow torso, gangly arms, and a long mustache, the type of body that kept political cartoonists in business. More importantly, Smoot reflected the new era. He was educated, monogamous, and Republican. The church hoped he could signal the faith's new priorities. But was America ready for a Republican senator? The entire Democratic Party, still smarting after losing Utah to their rivals, proclaimed no. They partnered with the Protestant establishment to try and get Smoot booted from his seat. Yet to signify the new era, Republicans stood by their own, and after 4 years of tense hearings, succeeded in helping Smoot retain his seat. As one senator put it, referencing Washington, D.C.'s otherwise scandalous reputation, quote, "I think the Senate should prefer a polygamist who doesn't polig to a monogamist who doesn't monog." Few followed the Smoot hearings as closely as J. Reuben Clark, a studious and solemn man in his 30s who is our third main character today. Known as Rube to his friends and family, and known for his round face and bow ties to everyone else, Clark was one of the eldest of 10 children born in the rural town of Grantsville, Utah in 1871. His mother, Mary Louisa, was a daughter of one of the territory's most successful businessmen and prominent bishops, a heredity that assured connections to the faith's elite. But Clark also inherited from his father, Joshua, a devotion to the Republican Party. These twin pillars of pioneer faith and political allegiance shaped Clark's life. After finishing at the top of his class at the University of Utah, Clark fled Zion for Columbia Law School in New York, where he impressed professors who then urged him to follow them into government appointments. He was promoted to United States Solicitor by 1910 and helped shape the nation's policy toward Mexico, a position he held until Democrats took control of the White House in 1913. Even out of office, however, and while balancing law practices in D.C. and New York City, Clark maintained several federal assignments and was awarded a Distinguished Medal of Service in 1920. Though Clark spent most of his adulthood away from Utah and outside of the faith, he didn't attend church, participate in temple rituals, or even pay tithing. His prominence and skill impressed church leaders, especially Heber J. Grant, who became the faith's prophet in 1918. Therefore, when there was an opening in the First Presidency in 1931, the three-man council that oversaw the entire church, Grant wanted Clark, who was then serving as ambassador to Mexico, to fill the position and modernize the faith. Grant's request arrived in Mexico City just before Christmas. Clark's initial response was to decline, and he labored for hours into the night, penning a letter explaining why. But his family encouraged him to accept the call. Clark, still torn, penned a second letter accepting the assignment. He then sent both letters, one accepting, one rejecting, to Salt Lake City, a reflection of mixed emotions. When the hefty envelope arrived in Salt Lake City, Heber J. Grant only cared about the acceptance note and ignored the other. Once Clark's ambassador duties were completed, which happened after the Democratic landslide of 1932 elections, Grant announced J. Reuben Clark as the new counselor of the First Presidency in the April 1933 General Conference. That's Clark on the left, Grant in the middle. Yet Clark discovered a nightmare when he arrived in Utah. A majority of church membership not only supported the Democrats, but they cheered Franklin Roosevelt's newly announced New Deal legislation. Like most of rural America, Utah was hard hit by the Great Depression of the late 1920s and rallied around the Democrats' progressive proposals. Clark, a lifelong committed and partisan Republican, could not fathom such a betrayal of what he believed to be the faith's core values. In his inaugural General Conference address, Clark chastised FDR for enabling idleness and proclaimed that America needed to return to old-time figures of industry, thrift, honesty, and self-reliance. Privately, he mused that establishing a socialistic or communistic state was behind the whole propaganda. This type of animosity toward FDR was increasingly prevalent in conservative religious communities. Much to Clark's chagrin, Utah residents received nearly 3 times the national average of federal assistance due to their vulnerable agrarian and mining economy. Further, several prominent LDS leaders were outspoken in supporting New Deal efforts. Clark feared the welfare state had infiltrated Zion. Convinced saints were taking advantage of the federal relief mechanisms, he called a meeting with church officials and was informed that 95% of those who received help were in genuine need. Couldn't the church take care of them, he asked? The question was absurd. One official scrawled the sobering truth across the top of the agenda for that meeting. Quote, if the church were to undertake to care this amount, it would bankrupt us. Clark then commenced a conservative push that eventually transformed the entire church. He drafted a 29-page memo detailing the federal government's overreach and how the church should reject coordination and instead take care of its own. He convinced the First Presidency to fully embrace the Republican agenda, particularly its full-throated opposition to the New Deal, and authored editorials directly opposing FDR's re-elections. His efforts were so vociferous that the conservative editors of the LA Times urged J. Reuben Clark to run against FDR as a Republican nominee in 1936. At first, his efforts were unsuccessful. 70% of Utah voted for Roosevelt in 1936. But Clark was unfazed and soon found a new vessel for ecclesiastical activism. Aided by other leaders, he introduced a new relief program called the Welfare Plan, patterned off of the GOP's preferred system of welfare capitalism that was aimed to take care of their own. The Welfare Plan, though immediately successful, never became as expansive as Clark envisioned. Only a fourth of the people Clark expected to wean off of government did so, as the New Deal remained the primary support for most members. Utah consumed the 12th most resources per capita in the nation, and the government spent 10 times the value of the church welfare plan within the state. The new program, Oh, here we go. All right, good. I'll be quicker in switching slides. The new program ably supplanted the New Deal, but it fell far short, the welfare plan ably supplemented the New Deal, but it fell far short of supplanting it. Nor did the saints immediately adopt the FDR phobia of their leaders. A majority voted for his re-election in both 1940 and 1944, each time over Clark's vocal and increasingly flustered opposition. The welfare program's true accomplishment was in its legacy. In Mormon memory, the welfare plan became a mythic, Herculean conqueror, single-handedly pulling each and every saint out of poverty. Its heroic feats were prima facie evidence that the church could take care of its own. Even if he failed in weaning the church off of federal assistance, Clark transformed the church's mindset, laying the groundwork for saints to embrace the backlash against America's liberal consensus, as well as take a firm side in the political battles that ensued over the following decade. Few mourned this creeping transition more than James Henry Moyle, a tall and broad-chested septuagenarian who served in Roosevelt's government. I am convinced, he wrote, that President Clark is the real cause of the political errors in the First Presidency. Moyle was despondent that his own faith was rejected, the very administration that he served. Moyle had previously found his Democratic allegiance within the mainstream of Mormon political culture, but now he sensed the ground shifting. He blamed Clark for ushering in a new era and was worried about the adverse effects of this course of conservatism that would follow. It would only be a matter of time, he assumed, before most believers followed suit. It was a frigid morning when Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated the 34th President of the United States on January 19, 1953, following a day of exceptional fog. But David O. McKay did not mind. To the new LDS president, America's future had never beamed so brightly. The fog of yesterday, which McKay believed to represent the fog of all that has been hanging over Washington for 20 years, he said, now vanished. McKay told those close to him at the inauguration festivities that, quote, the sunshine seems a manifestation of divine approval of Eisenhower's election. The remark failed to elicit laughs from the Democrats sitting near him. Although Eisenhower's inauguration and inaugural address was a privilege, McKay Attending Eisenhower's inaugural address was a privilege McKay never forgot. While he publicly insisted that the church was politically neutral, and even dismissed rumors that LDS leaders were all Republicans, he privately mused that Eisenhower's victory was the greatest thing to happen in 100 years. Then, unable to stay quiet, he confessed to a journalist that Ike's presidency would be the turning point in United States, if not world history. The only Mormon leader more infatuated with Eisenhower's election was Ezra Taft Benson, our fourth main character. Born in rural Idaho and educated at Iowa State College and Berkeley, Benson served several years as the executive secretary of the National Council of Farm Cooperatives, a position that brought him to D.C. to represent over 2 million farmers across America. His deep distrust of federal assistance meant he opposed many New Deal measures, like J. Reuben Clark, which he denounced as paternalistic government. Benson became a favorite for Republicans who pushed back against the liberal consensus, just as he was climbing the LDS ecclesiastical ladder. As a newly appointed apostle in 1943, Benson helped oversee the church's war relief effort and was sent to Europe in 1946 to help deliver 200,000 pounds of food in relief effort. His experience reaffirmed what he believed were the bitter fruits of godless socialism, a theme that dominated both his political and religious agendas. A fellow apostle once remarked that, quote, anyone who didn't agree with Brother Benson was indeed a communist. It was an exaggeration, but not by much. Now, Eisenhower tapped Benson as a Secretary of Agriculture. Though Benson muzzled his more radical views while serving in the moderate Eisenhower's cabinet, he soon became one of the nation's anti-communist crusaders during the 1960s. No true Latter-day Saint could be a communist or socialist, Benson declared, insisting that the welfare state was an unpersuasive cover for a creeping cabal. He was especially swept up in the conspiracy theory wing of the conservative movement. Though McKay never allowed Benson to officially join the radical John Birch Society, he did become close friends with its founder, Robert Birch, and often acted as a spokesperson for conspiratorial information. In this image, you see Robert Welch, the John Birch Society founder, on the left, and Ezra Taft Benson in the middle, all under a banner saying America, One Nation Under God. When Robert Welch published his book, The Politician, positing that Eisenhower was part of a global communist plot, even the soon-to-be Republican presidential nominee and partisan firebrand, Barry Goldwater, denounced the book. Benson, conversely, sent copies to his fellow apostles as Christmas presents. He also regaled the saints with addresses that echoed radical theories, including that Martin Luther King Jr. was a tool of communist deception. A few years later, he wrote the foreword for the racist diatribe, The Black Hammer, a study of black power, red influence, and white alternatives, one of the most extreme anti-civil rights works from the era. Benson was not alone in these efforts, of course. During these same years, Cleon Skousen, a BYU professor and one-time Salt Lake City police chief, became a popular Mormon author and speaker. His book, The Naked Communist, which classified communism as a global evil within an eternal war, was a bestseller, especially after David O. McKay praised it in General Conference. While the general Mormon body had been trending in a conservative direction for a few decades, both politically and socially, Benson and Skousen cemented the course. They capitalized on the region's shifting, like many other middle-class white communities during the tumultuous decade, against the social revolution. As the climactic year of 1968 approached, Benson only became more vehement in his political opinions. He was even chosen by George Wallace to be the Alabama segregationist running mate in his third party campaign, an act only halted when McKay refused to sign off. Eventually, leaders had to effectively silence Benson's public partisanship, convincing him it did not fit their increasingly global church. To be international, they decided, required disassociating from parochial politics. The First Presidency insisted that apostles should focus on gospel principles and leave politics or pointed attacks on politics out of their talks. No Mormon apostle would ever become as associated with partisan politics as Ezra Taft Benson was in the 1960s. But Benson's impact remained long afterward. His voice rang last, and it rang the longest. Mormon culture, especially in the Mountain West, was now firmly in the conservative camp. Lyndon Johnson's 1964 election was the last time Utah would ever vote a Democrat for president. The region's ground had permanently shifted, along with the rest of America's political geography in the wake of the era's unrest. The political alliance that J. Reuben Clark first envisioned during those dark days in 1890 had finally come to fruition. I'll go ahead and stop it there to save some time for a Q&A. Thank you.
All right, so it is close to 1:20. When it is 1:20, if you have a class afterwards, you can go. But we're gonna open up for questions for the next about 10 minutes. But if you have a class at 1:20, you can leave.
I won't be offended, I promise. No questions before you take off?
What first got you interested in the history of Mormon politics?
Yeah, so I was raised in the Latter-day Saint tradition, so I attended BYU. And then I became a historian of American politics in general. And then eventually, after I wrote a lot of stuff on early America, my interest circled back, and I decided I could use the expertise that I had learned in the academy to then explain my own religious heritage.
From what I understand, you wrote a book about this. Do you plan on pursuing a different focus on this subject, or?
Yeah, so I've now written 2 books on Mormonism with the emphasis on history. I've written another book that had nothing to do with Mormonism. I'm now working on a book that looks at religion and the abolitionist movement in the 1840s and 1850s Boston, where Mormons make no appearance. There's always an itch that I like to scratch about writing Mormon history, but yeah, so I'll always have some interest in it, but what form that will take, I don't know.
So I'm curious about the structure of your presentation. So if I remember your initial setup, it seemed to be this sort of path to the Mormon path to conservatism. But I'm wondering how much that gets sort of lost in that Democrats back in the 1800s were the conservatives,
Right.
and then that sort of
Right.
swapped as the GOP.
Right. Yeah.
And so it looks to be a little bit more like it was sort of, they started conservative, moved more moderate or liberal with FDR, and then that swung back with Benson. And so, in which case, it seems like your thesis is actually a little bit more interesting. It's not this sort of path from, liberal to conservative. It's
Right.
sort of this move and arc. It sort of ebbs and flows
Right.
over different political epochs with different political leaders and church leaders and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful frame. It's almost a rise and fall, right? Which is always a convincing framework. The only nuances that I would add to that is that the Mormon affiliation with the Democratic Party in the 19th century probably wasn't as deeply rooted in like political philosophy as it was the pragmatic alliances that the Democrats aren't interested in federal intervention. Right? So it was more of a based in that unique circumstances. But yeah, they did have more principles that aligned with that. I mean, definitely when it comes to populist principles, they aligned with some of those, and racial principles they did as well. Yeah, it really is, it's a product of the moment of the early 20th century where a lot of Mormons, because they had the economic industry crumbling around them, that many felt, you know what, maybe the government should be helping us dig out of this. And then suddenly, when the region, is prosperous and doesn't need that anymore, you get a political realignment. So yeah, I appreciate that framing. I think that works really well.
I'm wondering a little, I appreciate the presentation, it was great, and wondering your opinion on kind of future political involvement with Mormonism. And
Yeah.
you mentioned Mormonism and the LDS Church being like the highest percentage supporting religion of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And yet we also have Mitt Romney, who's probably the most prominent political Mormon, and he's been one of the only Republicans that's opposed to Trump. So what's your opinion of the future in Mormonism with those two different directions?
It's a great question because if I spoke a lot faster, I would have gotten to the last portion of my presentation where I talk about the last decade. So I appreciate giving me the chance to do it now. The 2016 election was the big stress test on this Mormon-Republican alliance, where you had lots of people across the nation, political commentators, analysts, scholars, saying that Donald Trump has a Mormon problem. Like, that was a literal headline. Donald Trump has a Mormon problem. Mormons aren't going to vote for him, especially when the Access Hollywood tapes come out, and the Deseret News, the church-owned newspaper, says Donald Trump should step down from his candidacy. And then, 2 weeks later, there is a political rally in Salt Lake City that is headlined by Mike Pence, because he's the more, conducive person to this community. Opening prayer is given by Julie Beck, who was previously the Relief Society president, General Relief Society president. And then a spokesperson was Robert Oakes, a former general authority for the church. And the language they used was pretty telling, where they kind of dance around the topic of Donald Trump not being, someone who represents our values. But, and this was their words, the Republican Party is home. It is time to come home. And despite whatever misgivings you have with Donald Trump, the Republican Party is where we find our standing. And what struck me about those words that they used was they were the exact same words that Pat Buchanan used in 1992 speaking to evangelicals, when evangelicals were not too happy about George H.W. Bush as the Republican candidate. And Pat Buchanan spoke at the RNC convention and said, "You may not like Bush, but the Republican Party is home." And Mormons ended up coming home to vote. I mean, there was a lower percentage who voted for Trump in 2016, but in part because Evan McMullen was an independent who was also a Mormon, and he won 20% of the state, because in 2020, Utah voting was right back to levels of what you'd expect for a Republican candidate. Now, the big question is the younger generations of Latter-day Saints. And because a recent study came out that something like 70% of Mormons over the age of 40 voted for Donald Trump, whereas only 30% of Mormons under the age of 40 did. So what does that mean that they're going to shift? Now, on the one hand, that is a change, because only 2 decades ago, the younger Mormon generation was just as conservative as the older Mormon generation, which was one of the only denominations in the nation that was like that. Now it seems like there are more liberal young Mormons. But I'm skeptical in thinking that that's going to be a formative base, because the defining issue for younger Latter-day Saints, LGBTQ topics, seems to be the hill on which the LDS Church is willing to fight. So does that mean younger Latter-day Saints are going to concede on those issues? Does that mean that they're going to transform the church? Or does that mean they're going to leave the church? I don't know. Historians make horrible prophets. And so those are a few scattershot thoughts on that excellent question. Anyone else? All right.
All right, well, I know that Dr. Park's going to be here. If any of you want to come talk to him after with the books, but let's give him one big round of applause for a great talk.